How to Draw Anything, a work instruction video. Drawing can be a difficult process, and it can be especially challenging and even confusing when drawing something that is unfamiliar. Luckily, there's an easy process that can be broken down into just 8 or less easy steps. Drawing is a valuable skill for artists, engineers, drafters, graphic designers, and many more professions. Drawing can also be a powerful and valuable hobby as it promotes creativity, critical thinking, fine motor skills, and the ability for one to express themselves even when words simply just aren't enough. Before starting the process, it's important to know some terminology. This terminology will help those who are trying to learn drawing understand the process of drawing in more detail. The first term is subject. The subject is the topic, focus, or image of the drawing. It can be thought of as whatever the drawing is of. For example, when drawing a dog, the subject is that dog. The second term is form. Form is the volume and/or shape of something or someone. This can be thought of as the basic shapes that come together to create all subjects. For example, a dog's head could be described as a form where the head is a sphere, the snout a circle, and the ears as triangles. Moving on to the first step of the process, it's time to gather materials. A pencil to draw with, paper to draw on, an eraser in case any mistakes are made, colored pencils to really make the drawing pop, a subject to draw, and one or more references to aid in finding the form of the subject. In this demonstration, I will be drawing an F-16 Fighting Falcon, which is an American fighter jet. However, these steps shown in the process can be applied to any subject regardless of how complex or how organic or inorganic the subject is. References can come in many different forms. Pictures are wonderful for capturing the subject in a single instance. Videos are perfect for capturing the subject in motion. Tangible items are physical representations of the subject and are ideal for understanding complex geometry. 3D models are much like tangible items, however, these are digital representations and lack the tangible aspect while still retaining the complex geometry. The surroundings can even be a reference, regardless of the tangibility, and best work for landscapes or still life drawings. The second step is to find the likeness of the subject. This can be done by finding the form, which in turn interprets the likeness. In order to find the form of the subject, all that the artist has to do is to start breaking down the subject into basic, easy to understand shapes. These shapes can range wildly, including boxes, cylinders, cones, pyramids, spheres, and even some 2D shapes, such as rectangles, which include squares, circles, triangles, and some other shapes. Note how these other shapes aren't necessarily in their own category, and that's because as the artist demonstrates their ability to break down the subject into basic shapes, it is dependent on how they think. So no matter what shapes they use to break down the subject, it does not matter so long as the form can still be found in all of those shapes. It's also important to recognize how each of the different shapes can bend or warp and twist, like these two boxes, or like this cylinder, which is being stretched and being bent into the shape of an arch, or the circle, which is stretched into an oval. And of course, triangles are just all over the place. My subject, the F-16, can be broken down into a cone for the nose, a cylinder for the body or fuselage of the aircraft, a stretched sphere for the canopy or cockpit, triangles for the wings and fins, and another cylinder for the air intake, which is slung underneath the aircraft. To demonstrate, I will draw my cone, the cylinder that makes up the main body, some triangles, some rectangles along the side, and then some triangles that don't actually come to a point, as they're cut off by pylons or hard points, depending on whom you ask. Here's the canopy, which is the shape of a stretched sphere that is pressed into the cockpit. The vertical fin, which is much like the shape of the wing, except there's no pylon at the end. Now we have the horizontal fins, the exhaust, which is simply just an extension of the fuselage, and the other fin, just barely in the frame. Now for the air intake, which is slung underneath the fuselage and is sunk into the fuselage, and the air intake actually kind of bends up into the engine, which would be in this area. Notice how I've drawn a shape that resembles the actual fighter jet, whilst just simply using basic shapes, using a combination of not only three-dimensional, but two-dimensional shapes as well. How the wings are triangles, and yet the fuselage is made out of cylinders and cones. This is important to understand because breaking down your subject into shapes will make it much easier to see and feel the likeness of the subject. Step 3 is to clean up the sketch. This involves adding or erasing lines to make the subject appear more clearly. Notice how in some areas I have multiple lines, which may make the image unclear, especially in this area here and along the leading edge of the wing. Not to mention how part of the air intake, despite not being visible from this angle, is still drawn as a complete cylinder. This step may also involve cleaning up existing lines, which means erasing and then redrawing those lines again. This is also the time for the artist to clean up any errors they see in terms of proportion or in terms of shape. This is important because without this step, the image appears very unclear. To start, the best line of action is to simply take a large eraser and run it across the entire image until it becomes a faint image. Notice how the image is still visible. However, it is not as bold. When drawing these lines, it is important to avoid what is known as chicken scratch, which is where one line is drawn by drawing several shorter lines that connect to each other. Chicken scratch makes the image look messy, which is not desired. Straight, clean lines will result in the best possible image. It is okay to go over some lines multiple times in order to bolden them, as long as you avoid chicken scratch. Anytime a mistake is made, the eraser should be used in order to correct. To do so, simply erase the line and redraw it and here the sketch is completely cleaned. There is no chicken scratch, and all the lines are straight and clean, except for the lines that shouldn't be straight, in which case those are curved as needed. The next step in this process, step number 4, is to add the details. This can include effects or other individual features of the image, of the subject. However, any lines that orientate the shape or the form of the image should have already been drawn in the previous 2 steps. This can include anything from smoke to individual components of the sketch. For example, on the F-16, I'm currently drawing what is known as the leading edge flap, which is a type of flap that moves up and down on the front of the wing. It is also advised that for any fine details, the artist sharpens his or her pencil in order to keep a fine point that they can use to draw small individual details. Here I am drawing the rudder, which is a type of flap on the vertical fin that moves left and right. I am drawing part of the canopy structure. Along with some detailing on the nose. The reference image I'm using shows all sorts of missiles and fuel tanks on the bottom of the wings. However, I'm foregoing those details because as the artist, it is important to recognize that the artist has complete control over what they decided to draw, whether that means omitting or adding certain details, or whether or not they want to stay true to the original source material, which is the reference. However, for learning how to draw something, you should stick to the source material, at least the main subject of the source material. And then later, once the artist has learned how to draw the source material, then they should, and only then, they should edit what details they decide to change or omit. Because learning to draw something is the process of which one tries to learn about a particular subject. And in this case, when it comes to learning to draw something, it really means focusing on the fundamentals and learning the shape and geometry of a subject from different angles, which is why this process should be repeated multiple times with different references of the same subject in order to make sure that the subject can be easily drawn even without a reference present. With that being said, I am done with all of the detailings that I plan on adding. And we can move on to the next step. Now it is time to shade the subject. This is, of course, an optional approach and an optional step, depending on what kind of drawing is taking place. Shading is a practice used to make sure that the artist understands light and the way that it interacts with the subject, but also that the artist understands how the shape of the subject affects the way that light interacts with it. Here, I have two examples of different types of shading. There are, of course, more types of shading than just this. However, these are the two most common ways with graphite especially. The more common way of the two is the gradient shading method. This works by defining what area of the shape gets the most light and which areas get the least amount of light, and then shading gradually, starting from the darkest areas and slowly, as they make their way to the lighter areas, slowly applying less and less pressure with their pencil. Graphite is a very interesting medium in that the harder you press, the darker the line, but also the more times you go over one area, regardless of pressure, the darker that area becomes. Using these two pieces of information, it is possible to create a smooth gradient. This is just a rough gradient and isn't perfect at all. However, it should show how to create this gradient and what gradient should look like. Here's the same gradient from a different perspective. Whereas the artist moves closer and closer to the light, they should pass over the same areas a less amount of time and with less pressure than they do in the darkest areas, where it's more likely that the artist will press harder and go over that area multiple times. When it comes to flat surfaces, the gradient works differently. Instead of simply starting at the darkest area and working to the lightest area, because there are no smooth curves, it is impossible to create a proper gradient. Instead, the next best thing is to select a surface, color that with your pencil until it is to a darkness that fits the tone, and then move on to the next surface and continue this process. Different surfaces will have different amounts of darkness and different amounts of light, and as such, each surface, while having a mostly uniform shading across the entire surface, should look different compared to another surface. Another way to shade is to use cross-hatching, which is mostly popular with ink-based methods. To crosshatch, you simply draw several short lines all next to each other, all parallel, and then draw several more short perpendicular lines in order to create crosses. The closer these lines are together, the denser they are, and the denser they are, and the more of these lines there are in a smaller area, the darker it appears in terms of shading. So on this sphere, the darkest areas have the most lines, And while this isn't a very good example of cross-hatching, it should give an idea of what cross-hatching looks like. This is the same thing, just from a different perspective. And then a rudimentary way of doing cross-hatching across flat surfaces. In this case, it worked the exact same as the gradient method, except, of course, instead of coloring the entire surface, you are just varying the amount of lines found from one surface to another. I will be using the gradient method in shading my F16. I'm going to pretend that my light source is somewhere up here, and it's shining down upon the F16. So I'll start coloring and shading the darkest areas first. In this case, the air intake is almost completely shaded black, simply because of its location. And then as we move to the wing, it is exposed almost entirely to the light. So instead of shading the top part of the wing, I will instead shade this area, which is the intersection between the fuselage and where the wing connects, where there would be less light. Notice how my lines, as I move to the lighter areas, become less dark. And as the light hits this tail fin, it actually prevents the light that hits this tail fin from reaching the rest of the aircraft. So instead it creates a darker shadow of the tail fin across the fuselage. Of course, one thing to note about shading is that if you plan on adding color, shading like this is ill-advised because shading will come after adding the color. With that being said, it's time to move on to color, which is the next step, step number 6, to add color. The name of the game in step number 6 is colors. That's because colors make everything pop, and colors can really add lots of contrast and bring the piece together very well. To start, choose the base colors. These base colors are the main colors of the drawing. The example of my F-16 will use a gray and a sky blue color as the base colors. When it comes to color combinations, there are plenty of great color combinations, but also plenty of poor color combinations, so just be conscious when choosing colors. To start, color the base colors as they appear in the subject. This F-16 that I'm drawing is gray in many places, however, is equally sky blue in other places. When using colored pencils, it can be sometimes tricky to get the colors to blend together. However, by lightly shading the entire image with these colors, there's a simple trick that can be used. Much like the gradient method for shading, if you apply more pressure in areas where colors are dominant and seek to blend them into areas where the colors mesh, just slowly ease off the pressure as you move into areas where the colors meet together. Doing so can create a gradient and really helps the entire image come together well. There are different names for different types of colors. By different types of colors, I mean specifically colors. These names are based on the amount that the color is used. The color that is used the most is considered the primary color, whereas colors that aren't used as much are considered tertiary and secondary colors. The primary color of this F16 is gray with a secondary color of sky blue. Once these colors are properly applied, then it is time to move on to step number 7. And step number 7 involves shading with color. When it comes to shading with colors, it's very similar to shading with pencils, where the darker areas require a darker shade and the lighter areas require a lighter shade. The fun part about colors is that instead of simply focusing on shading the dark areas, the artist can actually add highlights to the light areas. This can be done by using a lighter shade of the base color in the lighter areas of the drawing and using darker shades of the base color in the darker areas of the drawing. For shading, I will be using a dark gray along with a black, and for highlights I will be using this azure, which is a much lighter blue. And just like that, the image is complete. And now for the last and final step, step number 8, the artist should repeat this same process until they are happy with their own skills and abilities to draw the specific subject that they set out to learn in the first place.